Thank you very much for coming along today, and thank you, Rachel, for asking me to speak about plain language. My next slide was to tell you all about me, but Rachel's just done that, so I don't need to do that. But I would like to say thank you to some people whose slides I'm using or have adapted for this presentation. So Elizabeth Royal, Georg Gruschmeier, Nicole Pitcher, and Carolyn Hughes. So today, in this webinar, I'd like to talk about plain language in the review as a whole. I want to cover the structure of how we structure our text. I want to talk about the style that we use and the language that we use, and then I'll focus on plain language summaries. So I want to start with a little quiz. It's not very difficult. So there's a poll just come up on the screen, so if you'd like to just put your answers in there. Everybody got that right. It wasn't very difficult, but I think we just need to think about why we write reviews. So we don't want people to feel excluded because we're using acronyms and technical jargon. And we don't need to use long words to impress people, but we do want to communicate clearly. The next slide is a cartoon by Bill Watterson, which also shows what some people think about academic writing. So little Calvin has to do a book report on Dick and Jane. And if you're not familiar with Dick and Jane, it's a reader to help very small children learn how to read. So Calvin has realized that the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, to obscure poor reasoning, and to inhibit clarity. And he thinks that with a little practice, he can make his writing intimidating and an impenetrable fog. But obviously, that's not what we want. We need to write clearly and not bamboozle people with big words and difficult language. But it's not only academic writing that people struggle with. Since 1979, the Plain English campaign has been campaigning against gobbledygook, jargon, and misleading public information in all walks of life. For centuries, notable thinkers and writers have written about how it's important to express yourself as simply as you can. So don't use long words if you don't need to, and just be as simple as possible. In other walks of life, such as business, law firms, universities, and charities, we see lots of advice on how to communicate with your customers and people who work for you, and how to use plain language. And governments as well have been very keen to help people understand their messaging. So the UK government has written advice for its website, so their content needs to be clear, meaningful, and trustworthy to all our users. The European Commission has written a guide on how to write clearly in all EU languages. And in 2010, the US government passed the Plain Writing Act, and that requires all federal agencies to write clear communications that the public can understand and use. And that's very important. The public can understand and use. So all of these organizations are dealing with the public, and you might think, well, perhaps that doesn't really have much to do with me when I'm writing reviews. But who exactly are we writing for? So you can see on this slide, there's lots of different people that interact with Cochrane reviews and read some or all of a Cochrane review and get information from us. So it could be patients and carers, clinicians, researchers, guideline developers and decision makers, people who fund research, people who report on research and disseminate it, and people whose first language is not English. So it's a very diverse group of people that we're writing for, and that makes it very difficult to be specific. But one thing they all have in common is that they're probably all quite busy people. They have, in their jobs, they probably have a lot to read, and they probably need to take in a lot of information very quickly. And for that reason, it's important that we communicate in plain language and we don't try and be too complicated. So what exactly is plain language writing? Well, it needs to be well organized with a clear structure. The style should be as simple as possible. It needs to be very clear, and it needs to be concise, nice and short. And we should use everyday language with words that are appropriate for our reader. And what it's not is dumbing down. It's not an excuse to use sloppy grammar or incorrect grammar. It's not being overly simplistic, and your readers shouldn't feel that you're talking down to them or being patronising. So be organised. Before you start writing, think about what you want to say and make a plan. And put your most important points first, because people might not read everything. I know it's hard to believe, but they might not read the whole review. So make sure that you focus on the most important points first of all. You should be logical and consistent. So for example, when you write the background of your review, you're setting everything in context. You're explaining why there's a review question to answer. You're explaining all of the information about the review question, and you're defining your terms. So you might say, sometimes X is known as YZ, but for my purposes in this review, we're going to talk about this, and we're going to call it this, and this is what it means. So then when you come to the types of participants and interventions, nothing should be a surprise. Your reader should have read the background. They should understand what's happening, why you're answering this review question and what it means. And so they should be expecting certain outcomes and certain interventions. So you don't want to suddenly surprise them by, say, you're going to report on cost effectiveness if you haven't mentioned in the background that there might be a problem with the expense or the cost of the drug. And you want to make sure that you use the same terminology that you've defined in the background. And then as you move on to present your results, you need to present them in the same order that you've presented everything so far, and use the same terminology. And then you're not confusing anybody, and this helps to build readers' confidence in what you're saying. And if they have confidence in what you're saying, they're going to be able to take in the information much more easily. So when you structure your review, you should use headings and subheadings, because they help the reader to navigate the text, helps them to find what they're looking for, and it helps them to skip what they don't particularly want to read about this time. So RevMan already includes a framework of fixed headings and subheadings, which is obviously really useful for us. But you can also add your own headings and subheadings. So make sure that they're something that the reader can actually use to help them to find something that they're looking for. For example, if you have, say, if you're dealing with a drug that has lots of different classes or lots of different actions, you could group things together as long as it's in a helpful, meaningful way. And finally, when we talk about structure, we need to make sure that we leave plenty of white space on the page, because white space is kind of like a visual breathing room. It helps the reader to focus on the text. It makes the context easier to read, and it helps them to distinguish between different pieces of information. And one way to make sure you have white space is to write short paragraphs. So you're not got big chunks of text. Keep it nice and short. Your subheadings would also help to break up the text and leave white space. And if you have any long sentences, you can break those up too by using lists with bullet points or numbers. And this helps the readers to skim through and scan the text. So white space is very important. And also you need to be concise. The new focused review format has a recommended word limit of 10,000 words. So as well as it being a good idea to be concise from a style point of view, you also might find it easier to comply with the new word limit if you have a nice snappy style. So what you can do to achieve this is to use short sentences. So try and stick to around 15 to 20 words per sentence. You can vary the sentence length just to make your writing a bit more interesting. And if you have long sentences, you can split them into 2 or 3 sentences or use a list. Short sentences are much easier to read than long sentences. You should also use the active voice, which is where the subject acts. So for example, to bring things right to basics, the cat sat on the mat. So the cat is the subject. And in a review terminology, we might say the authors extract the data. So the active voice clarifies who did what. It's much less wordy than the passive voice, so you have shorter sentences. It's more dynamic, it's clearer, and it's easier to read. And importantly, it's accessible for people whose first language is not English. So this example here, participants were determined to be eligible by independent clinicians, is the passive voice. And you could change that to independent clinicians determined participants' eligibility. But I wanted to focus on this use of the word determined here, because sometimes when I read determined in a passive sentence like this, very often it makes me think that the participants were very keen to do something. They tried really hard to do something. So you could also be aware here that sometimes when you write in the passive voice, it's not necessarily as clear as it might be. Another way to be concise is to avoid wordy phrases, things like in order to or on a daily basis. You could just say to or daily. And the example I've used here is, and I've seen sentences like this, with regards to mortality, there were 10 studies where deaths due to any cause were reported. So we've got a passive in there as well. And you could easily simplify this to 10 studies reported deaths due to any cause. So finally, you should avoid nominalizations. And a nominalization is a verb or adjective that functions as a noun. So they're usually used with other words like undertook or carried out or conducted. So you undertake data extraction, for example, or you carry out an investigation. And you could simplify that very easily by just using the verb. So you say we extracted or we investigated, we decided or we compared. So for example, an investigation into X was carried out by 6 studies, or 6 studies investigated X. So you'll find that your sentences are a lot shorter and your style is a lot more concise. So you should also be direct. Try and imagine that you're talking to your reader and you're actually explaining something to them as if you're having a conversation. It makes your writing much more interesting and engaging. And it's okay to use constructions like don't, won't, couldn't. They make your writing a lot more direct and accessible. And also, if you use the active voice, it helps too, because it's clear who did what, and it's much more direct. And the language we should use, try and use short everyday words. So don't use a long word if a short word will do. So instead of saying commence, utilize, and frequently, you could say start, use, and often. So they're much simpler, much more everyday. You should avoid abbreviations and acronyms unless they're very well known, like BMI or HIV. If you do use an abbreviation, you should write it in full the first time, directly followed by the abbreviation in brackets. And you need to redefine in the abstract, in the main text, and in the author's conclusions. Not all abbreviations do need to be defined, and there's a list in the style manual of abbreviations that you can just leave as they are. HIV is one, grade is another. So you must also, if you can, avoid technical medical terms and jargon, and if you can't avoid them, you should explain them. Just because you have a wide variety of readers who are reading your review, and it may not always be clear to everybody what you're trying to explain. Use terminology consistently. So we've already touched on this. Don't confuse readers by using different words for the same thing. If you do, they can get very confused, and you don't want them to be having to search through the text because they thought is this the same thing? Did you call that something else somewhere else? So you just need to avoid that confusion, because if they're confused, they might lose confidence in what you're saying. When you write your review title, try and use words in your title that people will type into Google to search for. That also means that they'll be easier to understand. And also try and write for an international audience. So remember that some people who read Cochrane reviews do not have English as a first language, or they might live in anywhere in the world. We're a global community. So try and avoid colloquialisms. Remember that some drug names are different in different places. Measurement systems may be different, so I would advise you to use metric if you can, and if you use imperial measurements, then give a metric equivalent as well. And remember that summer is not the same in every month all over the world. Okay, we're going to have another quiz now. So obviously, the correct answer is that you should divide your text with subheadings and lists because they help to guide your reader, help them navigate the review, and you should leave plenty of white space. We know that we have short sentences, if we possibly can, short paragraphs, and we don't use additional words because we want a nice, concise style. Okay, so we'll focus on plain language summaries now. So what do we mean by plain language summaries? What are Cochrane plain language summaries? Well, they're a short, standalone summary of the key points of a Cochrane review. The maximum words they should be is 850, but if you can make them shorter, then do so. But they should really be more than 400 words. Otherwise, I think you need to add a few more points. Cochrane plain language summaries use words and sentence structures that are easy to understand, and we aim for a reading age of about 14 years. So that might sound quite low, but if you think that in the UK, a tabloid newspaper like The Sun, for example, might have a reading age of about 8, and a more serious newspaper like The Guardian would have a reading age of about 12, and 14 seems quite reasonable. And you can check the reading age of your writing on various applications, and even in Word, I think there's something called SMOG, which helps you to work out the reading age. And if you wanted to find out more about doing that, then you should look at the plain language summary guidance, which is in the handbook. Cochrane plain language summaries are written for people without specialist medical knowledge. So unlike the review that might have to deal with all sorts of different readers, plain language summaries are specifically written for the lay reader without specialist knowledge. However, this means that they're also good for people who are time poor and who need to gather and assimilate information very quickly. So a busy clinician or somebody who's just trying to read something in 5 minutes while they're, I don't know, on the train or waiting for the kettle to boil. Cochrane plain language summaries are also the most translated parts of Cochrane reviews, so they need to be written in a way that's easy to translate. Some of the COVID reviews were translated into 20 different languages. They're also the basis of dissemination. So people base news items on Cochrane.org or social media posts or press releases on your plain language summaries. And finally, they might be the only way that people access Cochrane evidence. So it's important that they're well written and informative. Most of the principles of writing in plain language that we've discussed so far also apply to the plain language summary. But the plain language summary has its own structure via the template, which has standard headings, and it also has spaces for user-defined headings, and we encourage you to use bullet points and lists. The template is available in the handbook, and it will also be embedded in the focused review format. So you should certainly be using that. And at the bottom of this slide, I've told you that where you can find the template and the guidance, and that's in the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions, Part 1, Chapter 3, Supplementary Material 2. As far as style goes, it's even more important than in the main text of the review to use short sentences with an uncomplicated structure. It's where language is concerned that we see the main differences between the review and the plain language summary. So use very short words if you can. Try and make sure that they have no more than 3 syllables. You need to use everyday language. So we'd use people, for example, not participants. It's important to explain all medical terms. Chronic, acute, local, placebo, even things that you think are very common and known by lots of people, because they might not be known by a lay reader For a plain language summary reader, local might mean just around the corner. It might not mean the same as the medical meaning, as somewhere specific on the body. And we don't use review jargon in plain language summaries. So don't say randomized controlled trial. Don't use the word intervention or the word outcome. We don't talk about grade or risk of bias or certainty of evidence. When you present your results, you need to present the same results that you present in the other summary sections of the review. So they should be the same as in the abstract and the summary of findings tables. But you need to use narrative statements, which use words like probably and may, and where possible, you need to use numbers. The narrative statements you can find in chapter 15 of the handbook, and also in the plain language summary guidance. There's a table that explains how they work. And numbers, as long as they make sense and they're accessible, and you can use phrases like 5 times more likely, or out of 100 people, or 8 out of 10 people, then you should use numbers to explain your results, and also give the number of studies and participants that the results are based on. But we do not use summary statistics and confidence intervals in the plain language summary. So be careful about words with nuanced meanings. So drugs, for example, could be seen as meaning illegal drugs rather than medicines. And significant might just mean important to somebody who's reading a plain language summary. Avoid acronyms and abbreviations if you possibly can. And again, in your title, use words that your readers will understand and search for. So I mentioned that we avoid review jargon because it's too specialized for plain language summaries. So instead of randomized controlled trial, we say study. Instead of participants, we'd say people with a particular condition, or be as specific as possible. Say adults or women or children or whatever group of people you're talking about. We don't use the word intervention. We use the name of the intervention, and the same with outcome. Don't use the word outcome. Use the name of the outcome. And we don't talk about adverse effects or harms. We talk about unwanted effects. And we don't use grade, risk of bias, or certainty of evidence. When you want to discuss the limitations of the evidence, we don't use the phrases high certainty, moderate certainty evidence, low certainty, or very low certainty evidence, but you can express those in a plainer way. So for high certainty evidence, you could say, we're confident that. For moderate certainty evidence, we're moderately confident, or our confidence in the evidence is moderate because. For low certainty evidence, you might have little confidence in the evidence because, or your confidence in the evidence could be limited. And for very low certainty evidence, you could say our confidence in the evidence is very low, or we don't know. Obviously, we don't say risk of bias. I've said that. We don't use words like inconsistency or indirectness or imprecision because they're all far too complex for a plain language summary. So if you can think of another way of explaining the reasons for downgrading your evidence in a more accessible way for people who don't have any systematic review knowledge, then you should definitely try and use words and phrases like, it's possible that people in the studies knew which treatment they were getting, or they were done in different types of people, or they didn't use very robust methods, or they didn't cover all the people we were interested in, or the studies were very small. So there's lots of different ways you can explain why the evidence limits your confidence without actually using any of those terms. So when you're writing, how can you simplify what you're writing? This is one technique. So you can identify words that you think your reader might find difficult or that aren't suitable for a plain language summary. Then you can generate a list of alternative words for each one of those. And then you choose the word that is most appropriate for your reader. So if you were writing in the main review text, it might be a different word from the plain language summary. And then you rewrite your sentence using the alternative word or words that you've selected. And then if necessary, you can reorganize your sentence or split it if it's too long. So this sentence, most smokers want to stop. However, many have difficulty doing so, even though they may use specialist drugs designed to aid smoking cessation. So that's quite a complex sentence. So how might we change that to simplify it? So first of all, it's important to note it's just one sentence and it's quite long. It's actually 23 words long. So I'm sure that we could split that and make 2 short sentences, or maybe even 3. Most smokers want to stop. Generally speaking, we refer to people not by what they do or what they have, but as people with a particular condition or problem. So I would change smokers there. I wouldn't use smokers. I would probably say people who want to smoke, or people who smoke, have difficulty doing so. So difficulty is not an unusual word, but it's a long word. And have difficulty doing so is quite a complex little phrase. So I think I might change that. They may use specialist drugs. So I've said that we don't use drugs because it could have negative connotations. And I don't know that we need to use the word specialist, because we go on to say that these drugs are designed to aid smoking cessation. So we could possibly lose that word. And then aid smoking cessation is also quite a complex little phrase. So I think we'll probably change that as well. So this is what we change it to. Most people who smoke want to stop, but many find it hard. People who smoke may use medicines to help them stop. So we've reduced the number of words altogether. We've made 2 shorter sentences and we've simplified it quite a lot. So when you've finished writing, I suggest that you set your writing aside, take a break, and then come back to it later. So if you can leave it overnight or for a couple of days, then that's great. And your writing will be much improved if you read it again with fresh eyes. If possible, you should also ask somebody who's not familiar with review or with the topic to read it. Can they see any problems with it? Is there anything they're reading that's not clear? Ask them, does it read well and make sense? And then when you get it back, you must proofread it, read it again, and you ask yourself the same question. Does it read well and make sense? Always run a spell check, make sure you've not missed anything obvious, and then don't be afraid to just edit. So do that for as long as you can until you think it's good or good enough, or you run out of time, or you've had enough of it. Right, so in conclusion, you need to structure your writing within a framework and be organized. Use plenty of white space, headings and subheadings, and put your most important points first. You should use a concise and direct style, and your language should be as simple as possible, but appropriate for your reader. Thank you.